All right. It looks like the attendees are mostly logged in. We've got a few still coming in a bit, but not, looks like it's leveling off a bit. So let's go ahead and get started. Thanks again for joining us here today. My name is Ryan Crodel from Valencell, and we're very happy to have with us here today the founder and chief immersion officer of a company called Immersion Neuro, a gentleman named Paul Zak. And we will get into a really interesting discussion today around using biometric wearables in a variety of different areas of neuroscience and human behavior. Before we dive into the discussion here, a few housekeeping items. First and foremost, we encourage these webinars to be as interactive as possible. And so please do submit any questions you have or anything you want us to dive deeper on through the Q&A method in the Zoom webinar panel, and we'll get to those questions as they come up. One of the first questions we almost always get is, will these slides be shared, and will this recording be shared? And the answer to both of those is yes. We will send both the slides and the recording out to the registrants for this webinar, usually within about 24 hours of the webinar wrapping up. So please do feel free to share that, either the recording or the slides or both with anyone that you think might be interested. And also, we encourage, if you have any questions or anything you'd like to discuss in more detail with us directly, please feel free to reach out to myself here from Valencell or to Paul at Immersion Neuro, and you'll see his contact information at the end. One other quick housekeeping note for those of you who've been on Valencell webinars before. This is going to be a little bit of a different format, and we're going to try to keep this as more of a discussion between Paul and I. We've got a few slides here to kind of frame that discussion, but wanted to try out a new format of having more of a discussion, a dialogue around this topic, framed by a few slides and some data and use cases and examples within those slides. So as I mentioned, encourage you to join that discussion. Please do submit questions in the Q&A, and we will we'll address those questions as they come in. So without further ado, Paul, I did a little bit of an introduction, but do you want to introduce yourself any further than that?
Sure, and thanks, Ryan, for inviting me, and everybody. We really want this to be a discussion, so just got a couple of slides and want to kind of stretch to think a little bit differently about wearables, and I'll give you some examples. So I have kind of two jobs. I'm a founder and the chief immersion officer of Immersion Neuroscience, which is the first neuroscience software as a service platform. And we'll talk a bit about that. We are big fans of the Valencell technology, and I'll tell you why in a minute. And also, I'm a professor at Claremont Graduate University in Southern California. And the company Immersion kind of grew out of research we did in my academic lab for the last 20 years or so. So I want to kind of give you an insight in that. Again, I think it's a very different application of wearables, and hope to generate a lot of discussion. So yeah, I'm really going to talk for about 10 minutes, and then Ryan and I are going to chat, and we invite you all to put some questions in, and happy to have a discussion. So yeah, here we go. This is me. Since you can't see my face, you can see my picture. And I'm moderately well known in the neuroscience literature for being the first lab to show that this neurochemical oxytocin has a fairly profound effect on human social behaviors. Essentially, I'm a tool guy. I developed a technology or an assay, a protocol to measure the brain's acute production of oxytocin. And once we had that tool, we could ask a lot of interesting questions about why humans do what they do. And we're very happy to get funding from DARPA, from a number of other government agencies that were interested in developing predictive models of what humans would do using signals from the central and peripheral nervous system. First of all, thank you to U.S. taxpayers. We burned a couple $1 million of taxpayer money developing technologies that would allow us to understand in particular why people are motivated to take particular actions. Why they purchase a product after advertising, why they see movie A instead of movie B, and fundamentally why we value human connection. And so much of my academic research has been on the underlying basis for human connection and human happiness. Also kind of by personality, I hate to see resources wasted. So 80% of movies lose money. How is that possible? How is it possible, at 10,000 years of human civilization, that we don't know a good piece of content from a bad one? So I want to give you a couple examples of what we've done with the data. This is actually using the balanced health technology. In short, because we had all this money from the US government, we basically measured every brain signal possible simultaneously. So high density EEG, peripheral neurologic signals. We did lots of blood draws to look at changes in neuroactive chemicals, and drug studies where we turn on and off different pathways in the brain. And we winnowed down this large set of signals into a set of signals that together were consistently predictive of what people would do after they had an experience. And so we essentially found a way to measure what the brain values second by second. And what people value, they will act on, they will remember, they will share. And so it gives us a tool, and which is why we started the Immersion company. We created a tool that allows anyone to assess in real time and at scale what people value, and what people value is what they will do. So applications in entertainment, applications to training and education, and currently exploring applications in the healthcare space as well. So I'll give you again a couple examples of that. So these signals that we identified are a way to predict what people will do. So people are complicated. We're all complicated. So how do we predict that? Once we developed this technology, we realized that if we wanted to get this out of the lab and really make it available, we needed wearables. And so we evaluated lots of different wearables against medical grade technology. And the balanced cell wearable correlates around 0.9 with a medical grade electrocardiogram. It's really, really good technology. Lots of other good things about it. We get data from other wearables as well, but we're big fans of that. So anyway, let me show you what we're doing, and then we'll just have some discussion. So what we found from 20 years of published neuroscience is that this valuation mechanism that tells us what people will do is a function of two things. One is you got to pay attention to the experience that you're in. If you're asleep, nothing's going to happen. But second, you have to really care about it. It's got to resonate emotionally with you, and that's where that value comes in. So I've coined this term immersion to denote this neurologic state in which you're attentive to the information around you and you really care about it. It emotionally resonates with you. By that I mean that you begin to share the emotions of the other people in the experience, whether that's a movie, whether that's individuals around you. So it's associated with empathy. So attention comes from the brain's prefrontal cortex. It's metabolically costly, so it raises heart rate, increases sweat in the palms. And emotional resonance, we've shown, is associated with the brain's production of oxytocin, which binds to receptors in the vagus nerve in the heart. And so you can measure that downstream as well as in the central nervous system. So once we kind of combine these into an overall measure we call immersion, we optimize that measure to predict as accurately as possible different behaviors that people will do. So when we first started doing this, scientists are super skeptical, just kind of by training and personality too. So I thought, maybe we're just lucky, right? We published a lot of stuff, but maybe we're just lucky. So we started looking at Super Bowl commercials, and we said, gosh, every year thousands of people rate these Super Bowl commercials 1 to 10 and how much they like them. Immersion should predict what people like. Super Bowl commercials are very expensive. They're $5 million for 30 minutes. Spend a lot of, just to air it, spend much more money to produce it and get stars. So when we started doing this, this is from the 2018 Super Bowl, I'm going to show you this ad. So this one was a bit of an anomaly for us. It was the most immersive using neuroscience measures, but it was one of the least liked commercials. So I'm going to play this and animate. We've animated the this measure Immersion below it. By the way, we captured this data live at a bar in California while the Super Bowl was running, and we handed out wearables from Scotia using the valve cell technology. And so we had 50 people, and we said, "Hey, we're gonna buy you all drinks and food if you wear these wearables." And we collected data live. So using our platform. So again, I'm sorry about that. That's the Mac being very sensitive. You know, the technology we developed basically takes the signal from popular wearables, shoots that to the cloud directly from the wearable or via phone, and then applies algorithms to infer what the brain is doing, the central nervous system, from activity in the peripheral nervous system. Again, because we've traced out these pathways very carefully. So the key here is that we can infer brain states from the peripheral nerves and use that to develop predictive models. So let's look at this and then we'll just talk about it.
Diet Coke Twisted Mango because that's why. Can't help it. Hey, still going. Maybe slowing it down. Maybe it's getting sexier. I don't know. Mango does.
So that is a super weird commercial, right? So it's not likable. You know, thousands of people said they didn't really like it, but it's very immersive to the brain. So we normalized immersion to run from 0 to 10, easy to understand, benchmarks around 4 for short form videos like this. So this thing starts at 5 and then has this nice peak here. If you see my mouse when she says, now I'm slowing down, now I'm getting sexier. It's a very weird commercial. The woman's kind of a giraffe sized person. She's got the funny socks and she's moving weird. So from a predicting what people will do perspective, I don't care about liking. In fact, liking, you know, self-report, you know, do you like this? Do you intend to do whatever? Has very little impact on what individuals will do and what aggregate individuals, that is market behavior. Maybe 20% predictability if you use liking. For immersion, we find consistently around 80% ability to predict things like sales bumps after advertising, movie ticket sales from people watching movie trailers, top-rated TV shows, what songs will be hits, how much information people remember from training. So this kind of evaluation mechanism in the brain is not about liking. It's not about feelings. So imagine my poor wife, because I say, I'm not interested in feelings, I'm interested in what people do. And so this technology is meant to predict what people will do and in fact, what aggregate people will do. So Diet Coke had been flat for about 3 years. Starting in first quarter 2018, they saw their first bump in sales. Again, not all due to this commercial, but this commercial was part of that, a much larger campaign, specialty flavors and all that. So okay, so
quick question, if I can jump in real quick. We've had a few questions come in, and I've got one of my own just to understand a little further. So can you talk a little bit more about the metric we see on this chart? And I'd like to understand a little bit more about what biometrics go into that. Obviously, the Scotia rhythm device that you're using is primarily a heart rate monitor, but are you using any other biometrics as part of this equation?
All from the Scotia wearable. So again, we can infer attention because attention is metabolically costly. So I can capture that from a heart rate monitor. And then the key part, most of the variation of this data comes from this emotional resonance, which is driven by the brain's production of oxytocin. Oxytocin is released in the brain, but also in the bloodstream, where it binds to the vagus nerve in the heart. And so we can see subtle changes in the rhythms of the heart to infer what's happening regarding oxytocin in the brain. So we do a bunch of mathematical transformations to take that heart rate data and transform it into these measures that we collected by measuring brain activity directly. So again, what we did is we collected central and peripheral activity directly and then related those to each other, and then trace out the pathways to ensure that the relationships were causal, because the brain's adapting at millisecond frequency to its environment. So again, it took us 20 years to figure this out, and then took those two factors, this emotional resonance and attention, and weighted them in a way to optimize prediction of actions.
Got it. That's very cool.
Yeah.
This is, I thought about this as well. We had another question come in asking about how alcohol would impact your findings. You mentioned you bought these people drinks at during the Super Bowl. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, we didn't buy them enough. I'm a cheap guy, as I said, so we didn't buy them enough to get them drunk. But yeah, certainly alcohol affects the brain globally, but also in particular affects prefrontal activity, where attention comes from. So you know, as long as you have a big enough sample size, then that's gonna average out. So my academic lab, we actually have studied alcohol a fair amount. Doesn't seem to affect these pathways strongly, but yeah, it's a good question.
Yeah.
We've done this lots of different ways. This was just a fun one to do live, again, because I think the you know, the technology of wearables is so robust now that we can really get those signals. So we really need good wearables, and we've tested so many. There's lots of bad wearables. Maybe bad's too strong, but you know, wearables in which there's a large amount of unforecastable, noisy data in it. The quality is not as good. So anyway,
yeah.
You know,
along those lines, we've had several questions come in. Sorry, just on that topic of the name of the specific device being used and the sensor technology involved. So the device is called the Scosh Rhythm Plus. It's the Rhythm Plus, right? Not the Rhythm 24.
I think it's Rhythm Plus, exactly right. Yeah.
And the sensor technology in there is a PPG sensor technology from Valence Cell.
Exactly right. Yeah, using 3 green lasers, which are averaged. So yeah, and there are, you know, quite good wearables out there, you know, so that we also get data from. But yeah, the key is, you know, taking that baseline heart rate data and then doing unnatural things to a natural data stream to figure out what people will do. And you know, how do we know it works? Well, for this, for all the commercials, 85 commercials in the 2018 Super Bowl, we looked at the ability to predict what people would do. And we don't have sales bump data for these companies, but we do have some kind of indicator of that, which is YouTube views and YouTube comments. All those Super Bowl commercials go online. And we find that Immersion has a nice positive correlation with these you know, proxies for impact of those commercials, and self-reported liking has a negative correlation. So if you're asking people what they like, you're kind of running a fool's errand, because it's not a very anchored kind of question, and it's really a question about unconscious emotional responses that we can pick up using wearables. So we published lots of this research. Feel free to Google Scholar me, and you can just download tons of stuff. And my lab posts everything online. So we tested this a lot of different ways, you know, with kind of medical grade equipment as well as with wearables. So here's just a fun one. This actually uses an older wearable. And just to talk, we're going to get to happiness and health in a minute. So one of the key areas that make us happy and also drive us insane, but make us happy, is relationships. So good relationships are very strongly associated with better health outcomes and greater positive mood, and bad relationships are the opposite. So we were invited by NHK TV in Japan to work on a show about saving marriages. So apparently in Japan, there's a large number of middle-aged women who are divorcing their husbands for reasons that you can guess. So the husbands work too much, they're not affectionate, you know, they don't help around the house. And as you know, Japanese people have very long life. And so I think the women are thinking, like, I cannot do 40 more years with this dude. Like, you know, the kids are teenagers or whatever, I'm going to get out. So this is in Japanese. So I'm just going to talk over it. So I just shared you a little clip of this. So it's my colleague, George Barraza, co-founder of Immersion. You know, basically, we used an earlier version of this technology, which we collected a baseline. This is a wearable that's no longer made, that we capture data from, apply our algorithms. And what we did was we actually had this couple who, again, this NHK is a national broadcaster in Japan. So this woman actually said to the national broadcaster, for the last 2 years, I've been thinking of divorcing my husband. So if you say that on national TV, you are down the road. So you can see a much more basic interface. This is some years ago. But basically watching them in real time. And the reason I want to show you this video is to show that we actually can process with cloud servers in real time and capture what people value. And so we had them do some activities, and we showed that we could actually increase their immersion in each other by spending time together. I sort of coached them through all this. And then I finally showed the wife the data, and she starts crying. And she said, basically, I never knew that my husband really cared about me. Now, if you notice, I had to push the husband, like, hug your wife, come on, you just had a breakthrough. So anyway, maybe she should divorce him, I'm not sure. But in any case, it allows us to capture what people really care about when they themselves can't do that. And which means if you can capture it, you can actually manage your life. You can capture what is interesting to you, to that person. So think of this as sort of a neural prosthetic, right? It extends your conscious brain activity to capture unconscious emotional responses to see what's there. Ryan, do you want to jump in with a couple questions, or I've got like three more?
Yeah, we've had a few come in. Going back to the Diet Coke ad, one of the questions was the ad evaluated to be effective or not? I think you touched on that a bit, but
yeah, I mean, we've done actually blinded work. Again, we're a software platform. We're a measurement technology, so clients use this any way they like. It's a SaaS software service. So the global ad agency BBDO, in some early work we did, challenged us to a blinded test. They actually had sales bump data from ads that they had produced for a variety of different clients. And they said, okay, our clients have ranked these ads for high, medium, low sales bump. See if you can find the right rankings using only Immersion. I said, awesome, that's great, blinded test, let's do that. And we were able to predict with 83% accuracy which ads produced the highest sales bump. And again, each of those clients had used a different methodology to capture sales bump. So it's pretty amazing. Again, had a client who was in the reality TV space, a big reality TV producer, and they used our technology. They could predict which reality TV. A lot of those shows are not very good. They gave us shows that were really were hits and their misses, and we had about 60 people watch them, measured immersion, and actually just watched the first act of those shows, and we could predict with 88% accuracy which were the hits from the misses. So somehow your brain knows whatever these signals are that we've found and combined into this measure immersion seems to tell us from a small number of people what the aggregate population will do with fairly high accuracy. So
very cool.
Yeah.
One other question, and I had the same question of it. Is the analysis live, or is it done on recorded data sets? And do you need a large amount of subjects, or does it work on individuals? I think the video from Japan spoke to that a little bit, but maybe you can elaborate on that a bit.
Yeah, so you can do, it's a very good question. So you can do a power test calculation and show that to have statistically reliable data, you need 35 people. If you want to segment that sample, males versus females, young, old, then you want about 35 per cell. So because we're getting data second by second, the size effects are quite large. So for, to look at trends, we have clients who may use, say, people from the office, grab 10 people. Hey, we just roughed out a movie trailer. Let's have 10 people from accounting watch it and just get a trend on whether, this thing is above or below benchmark. And yes, live. So we wrote very efficient algorithms so that this data is actually coming in live. So live means, depending on the strength of your wireless signal, might be delayed a second or two, but from around the world. So this is virtual. And one of the kind of sort of sad things about the COVID quarantines is that you can't really put people in a room. So lab-based neuroscience is just stopped. But because we can collect data wherever people are, at home, any place, and aggregate them in real time together, give them an experience, that we have clients who use our technology particularly to manage remote meetings, remote training. We have clients in the K-12 education space. Gosh, if you have kids in school, you know that the school districts are just not organized to really have fabulous virtual classes. My school-age kids, the teachers were horrendous. Not because they're bad people, this is a brand new world. So, if you need those meetings, that education, that training to be effective, and you actually care about effectiveness, you got to measure, or else you're just guessing. And again, putting my scientist hat on, I'm against the guessing approach.
Indeed. On that topic of the real live versus recorded data sets, there was a question that came in about how you synchronize the devices in real time.
Yeah, so that's a good question. So we basically can start this on a calendar invite. So if our meeting starts at noon Eastern, then you get a calendar invite and it automatically starts and stops. If you're doing market research, you can invite people to a certain, watch a video conference, and you can manually start and stop those. But basically, it's an auto start and stop on time is the easiest way to do it. Or you can do it asynchronously, right? You can just collect data, and then the platform will actually aggregate that across different time periods. So for market researchers, if they're looking at, I want to run 5 different samples, one in Philly, one in Chicago, one in LA. Again, you can just identify those as part of the same, we call event, and it'll aggregate that together.
Gotcha.
You know.
And one other question we'll touch on now. There's several other questions that have come in that you'll touch on in a bit, but one that I think is particularly relevant here to this safety and readiness piece is what's the impact on the immersion parameter of stress?
Yeah, that's a perfect segue into this. This is a longer conversation, so I'll try to do it briefly. So most things in biology have this inverted U curve. So zero stress, it's really not stress, it's really arousal. So stress is really a psychological state. So let's talk about physiologic arousal. So increase in heart rate, sweat. If you have no arousal, then you're a couch potato, and nothing very interesting happens to you. If you're over aroused, then people at some point start to shut down or avoid that stimulus. And so actually you need moderate amount of arousal to actually be immersed in experience. So if you think of movies, think of the beginning of every James Bond movie, right? Which is James Bond running across the roof of a building with bullets flying at his feet, and damsel in distress at the edge of the building, and he saves her in the nick of time. Well, that raises your heart rate, that makes your palm sweat, right? So that's a reason that these movies start, quote, hot, is they want to get you into this movie. They want to cause physiologic arousal. So you need enough arousal to have this attentional response part of immersion, but too much will shut that down. So knowing that, we had a question with a client who's using our technology in the employee performance space, and they said exactly that. Gosh, we'd actually like to measure that. So we created this measure called psychological safety. This grew out of work that Google did about 10 years ago, showing it was the best predictor of how productive teams were. But Google developed a survey around that. We thought, gosh, it's really hard to identify how safe I feel. Maybe I can, maybe I can't, but it'd be nice to actually have that passively second by second so I could manage that. And so we developed, I think, the first physiologic measure of psychological safety. You can think of that as the inverse of anxiety. So if you're really anxious, you just don't have a lot of bandwidth in your brain to learn something new or to collaborate with your colleagues. You're just trying to survive for the next 10 minutes. So we use that measure to assess those outcomes. So again, if your psychological safety is low, then it's going to be very difficult for you to be immersed in that. So a couple interesting things that we've seen applications of this. One of our biggest clients is Accenture. They produce a lot of training for their employees, and we find very strong correlation between immersion and information recall after training. They use what I call the 20-20-20 rule, which is no more than 20 minutes of presentation, and after that 20 minutes of active participatory tasks to reinforce the information that was presented, and then 20 minutes of debrief of that information. So how did you do it, Bob? How did you do it, Susan? So that we reinforce that. Second, Media Education is a client of ours, which is in the K-12 space. They use this, have teachers use our technology. The kids are wearing wearables. The parents obviously consent for this. And then you can actually see, as soon as the class is over, using our Immersion leaderboard, which kids really understood the information, which kids can explain it to others, which kids understood it just fine and will pass the test, and which kids need feedback now. Don't wait till the test comes up in 2 weeks. If that information just didn't land in the kids' brains for whatever reason, awesome. Give them a follow-up, hit them with Khan Academy or whatever. So a great example of this very briefly is watching a teacher use our technology was a little girl named Maria who was really quiet in a math class, and yet she was on top of the leaderboard for 3 days in a row. And then the teacher sort of after class called her up and said, hey, it seems like you like math. And this little girl just blossomed, you know, and all of a sudden she became a class leader, and the teacher called on her more. And the teacher said, you know, she was a quiet kid. I just figured she didn't care about class. I didn't really know. And so again, having this kind of neuroprosthetic, this technology that allows you to figure out what people really dig, I think is useful. And then lastly, this measure of psychological safety was used at a undergraduate principles of economic course, which is, if you took economics, you know, it's kind of a 0-1. Either you get it right away or it just that doesn't make sense to you. And very strong correlation between psychological safety for A classes prior to the midterm and student grades, with a 10% increase in psychological safety, increasing their midterm grades by a full letter. So again, the effect sizes are quite large here.
Okay. So Paul, some interesting, before we jump to the next topic, some good questions have come in around this piece. Several questions around the topic of consideration for individual differences in interpersonal development, and back to the arousal response. Is there any level of kind of or difference of personality in terms of extroverts and introverts responding to different stimuli in different ways?
What a great neuroscience question. Whoever asked that question, A+ for asking a deep question. So yeah, so we looked at that. So there are personality differences that are related to higher immersion. So it's not introvert, extrovert, although we tested that. Individuals who are more immersed tend to be more agreeable by personality and more empathic. So these are very warm people. They have bigger emotional responses, and they'll get a bigger, you know, for the same stimulus, video or a class, they'll get a bigger immersion response. And they're just built that way, which is interesting. So again, from a sort of analytical perspective, I'd want, you know, 35 people or so to have, so, you know, so the outliers balance each other out. But from a kind of education training space, that's actually where you want to know about this. So if these people who are agreeable and empathic tend to enjoy or learn better from the teaching itself. That is, they want a teacher in the classroom, where other folks who are maybe more introverted or less agreeable, they'd rather just read the book and not go to class. So I think, yeah, it really is our technology provides customized feedback because you know how your brain is responding to that stimulus.
Gotcha. One question actually coming in back on the previous slide around psychological safety. How is safety different from immersion from a signal perspective? Or is
yeah, there is a big difference. So there's a negative correlation between psychological safety and immersion. The average of that is around minus 0.3 correlation. So again, psychological safety is really capturing this, that inverted U curve for arousal, kind of over arousal. And so we can get that again from particularly looking at heart rate variability. So we basically empirically created bands around that tell us that you're kind of over aroused. It's called sympathetic arousal, sympathetic nervous system. So kind of over aroused. And so we can find bands where people are, and then there are people who are just appropriately aroused, and they're fine. So yeah, so it's a different measure than immersion. And again, I think what's nice about these measures is they are orthogonal to everything else you're measuring. They're not related to, other than this kind of weak positive correlation with a personality type, they're not related to gender, they're not related to demographics, location. There's just kind of a very clean new data stream that can be used in predictive models of what these interesting creatures called humans might be doing.
Gotcha. One quick question specifically around, I believe this is related to the economics course here. It says the correlation of At 0.35, if R squared seems rather low, how significant was the result in terms of the F test?
This is not an R squared, this is an R, right? This is actually a correlation between average psychological safety and their grades. That's a hell of a high correlation for neurologic data, which is inherently very, very noisy. So yeah, so, typical neurologic correlations might be in the 0.05 range. So again, the size effect is big here, right? So this is statistically significant effect. So yeah, it's I forgot how many kids this was for, but whatever a class of kids are, 20, 25 kids.
Gotcha. Okay. There's a bunch of technical questions that have come in that we'll wait till the end here, but let's carry on for now.
I got like 2 more slides. So we have clients now applying this to the health and happiness space. So again, if you can build more factors into your life, more experiences that bring you happiness and joy, then people acclimate to that. We also have a measure of neurologic frustration, where you're physiologically attentive, but you just don't like the experience. And so I'm going to show you a picture of that in a second. So over time, you can assess kind of what you really enjoy doing, what you're going to put more effort into if you're an employee, and what you'd rather not do or need more training or education to do. So we have an API that allows us to augment other quantified self apps. And so I think there's real opportunity here, particularly as we're more isolated with social distancing, to think about how to create better patient experiences, better employee experiences. And so here's it's a little hard to see, I think, for the colors are not so great, but there's a way to actually track what you're doing over time and develop self-knowledge about what do I enjoy doing at work, for example. So this really changes the discussion of employees with their supervisors. Instead of supervisors saying, hey, Ryan, we want you to do more of this because we're short of a person or whatever. Now, actually, you and your supervisor would know, like, hey, what I really dig doing is working with clients, coaching my team, doing accounting. I'm just going to put more effort into that. If I enjoy it, I'm going to do more of it or put more discretionary effort in. And what I don't like doing are these things. So either train me up on those things or have someone else do it. So it really allows for people to kind of optimize their work experience, but easy to port that over into your life experience. So really identifying, making conscious the unconscious response to what people enjoy doing, and then give me more of that stuff. So yeah, that's it. Happy to take more questions. Here's my contact info. People can certainly feel free to reach out to me. We're a startup. We're really excited about bringing this technology out in the world. But yeah, happy to have lots more questions, Ryan. Hit me with some more.
Yep, lots of questions here. And please do, for everyone, keep them coming. There's great questions here. Let's see. So I want to go back. We missed a few earlier that I want to come back to. So have you looked at chronic pain or fibromyalgia patients, and if so, are they any different?
I have not, so I can't answer that. Yeah, good question.
Okay. Another similar question on any studies on the effectiveness of yoga and meditation.
Yeah, we've done a fair amount of studies on that. Very good question. And in fact, we find even fairly short guided meditation increase psychological safety and appear to prime us to be more immersed in the next experience. So as people may know, Google kind of famously has a very short 3 to 5 minute centering kind of breathing meditation they do before their meetings, just to get people focused and kind of, get away from the stuff that you were doing before the meeting started. And it seems to be, fairly useful. So yeah, a big fans of that. Our meeting app will actually tell you that at the end of the meeting, we'll say, hey, here's some suggestions on things you might do. People who just weren't ready for this meeting. It didn't go well for various reasons. And there's more metrics on the site than I'm showing you guys. But and so yeah, I think the reason to quantify kind of they're basically all social interactions. The reason to quantify them is they're kind of hard to intuit yourself. It's hard to read people very precisely, number one. And number two, if you don't measure it, you can't manage it for better performance. So I think in particular, we've seen very rapid growth in our technology being used for virtual meetings and virtual work, because we're in a whole new world and we just don't know how to manage teams, who are, consistently far away from us.
Yeah, especially these days. Next question is, and this may be too much information, so if you don't want to answer that, just let me know, but what PPG sampling rate is needed for the Immersion platform to work best?
Great question. I have no idea. I'm sure our CTO knows that, but I don't.
Yeah, gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay. Similar question on the frequency of the heart rate data. Is it once per minute? I think you mentioned this earlier, but it's once per second.
It's once per second, yeah. And actually varies a bunch. Apple Watch is once every 5 seconds. So we can get data from Apple Watch. We have to do some interpolation on that. But yeah, the higher the quality signal, the more accurate the predictions.
Got it, yeah. Let's see, already answered that one. Do you plan to use EEG to track neuro response?
No. Do you want to wear a helmet around in your life? No, you don't want to do that. And what we found is that the EEG signals that we've measured, again, with high density, 120 lead EEG, are not statistically robust. By that, I mean, they don't consistently predict what people will do. And actually, they add almost no predictive ability to the immersion measure. So, the neurons in the brain are almost all general purpose. And those general purpose neurons are doing lots of things. But when I get data coming out of the neck, which is from the central to the peripheral nervous system, those are integrated signals. Those are much more robust statistically. And that's why we measured everything simultaneously.
Gotcha. Next question. What do you feel is the role of the vagus nerve in stress and relaxation?
Yeah, great. Again, great technical question. So vagus nerve, for people who don't know, is the longest cranial nerve and innervates the heart and the gut, and is a key part of the sort of calming branch of the nervous system. There's sort of a go side and a calming side. And so, yeah, so the activity of the vagus goes into the algorithm for immersion, and it really tells us about people's ability, again, to kind of relax and acquire new information or have a great experience.
Got it. Yeah, and actually the question around yoga and meditation, and you mentioned obviously the example of the Super Bowl commercial. I'm curious, is there any, or what are the limitations around the testing and the data collection in terms of what the individual or group of people are doing at that time? Do they have to be sitting down, or can they be going about their daily activities to do this data collection, or what does that look like?
Yeah, daily activity. So I think a great thing about the balance cell sensor is there's motion correction in it, right? So the chip. So I'm sure you know more about that than I do, Ryan. But when we tested it for motion, it has a very effective motion correction. So yeah, wherever you are, moving around, it's great. And we always baseline, and this is another technical question, right? So everyone's physiology is a bit different. So we always baseline correct data so that when we aggregate individuals for analysis, that aggregation is meaningful.
Got it. This is interesting. So next question is, from my limited understanding, children with autism spectrum disorders have dysregulated oxytocin production or secretion. Any data on the use of immersion in this population?
What a wonderful question. Yeah, so my academic lab, we've done a fair amount of work with patients with autism, including very recent doctoral dissertations from my graduate students. And the questionnaire is exactly right. So we see dysregulated oxytocin, and studies which replace that oxytocin have very little effect on behaviors because the larger brain networks are activated. So we've actually shown that a number of therapies can actually increase psychological safety. So people with autism tend to be fairly kind of sensitive to information, kind of almost overloaded with information. So psychological safety is a great way to track how different therapies impact the ability of people with autism, which again is on a spectrum, so it varies. For example, I have a student who's studying swim therapy, and we had a 16-year-old with autism who had not spoken for about 10 years. And while we were measuring his physiological response to swim therapy, spoke for the first time. And we videotaped it. And gosh, I'm almost tearing up telling you about it. It was an amazing experience to not only have a therapy that would really help this young man and honestly his family, but to see why it's working, right? And so really, so yeah, that psychological safety is a great measure. And again, for the Scotia Rhythm, waterproof, it's very tough. It's really a great wearable.
Indeed, I would certainly agree. So next question, let's see, where are we? Oh, any other healthcare related applications like Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, depression, et cetera?
Yeah, not right now. We've explored those in other areas in my lab, but I think the applications we're looking at in healthcare are twofold. One is patient experience. So we know that patients who have a better experience in the clinic or in the hospital tend to be more compliant with their orders. They tend to take their meds, and they're less likely to return. Call them boomerang patients, right? Bounce back because they didn't get well. So I think that's part of it. And now, particularly with COVID, we have a couple clients that are looking at using our technology to assess clinician burnout, which is really an issue. Yeah, I think, just being able to track passively how effectively people are going through their day, and then developing indicators that tell us, oh, look, this person's really getting too close to having a bad outcome or being depressed. So let's give him or her some days off, or let's have them speak to a counselor, or lots of things. Cleveland Clinic famously has called the lavender ribbon effect. So people have had a really bad day. Clinicians have a really bad day. So a patient died or whatever. They put a lavender ribbon on that says, hey, I need a little extra space, a little extra care. And Cleveland Clinic will have a massage therapist and counselors to talk to their clinicians. So I think that's really the future. If you want to provide great healthcare, then the clinicians also have to be cared for. And how do you know that? You got to measure. It could, maybe I can tell you, but having spent a lot of time in hospitals in my life working with patients, clinicians generally don't want to say, hey, you know what, I am burnout, or maybe they don't even know. So, having a wearable track that, I think, is quite useful.
Yeah, being able to quantify that is a real difference maker. A couple of questions around, I think you addressed this earlier, but is this only PPG signals or EEG as well? And then you addressed that there's another question around motion artifacts related to PPG, but maybe back to the question of PPG only or EEG also?
Yeah, PPG only. Again, we measured everything, known to humans simultaneously, functional MRI, but we needed something, if it's really going to be SaaS that anyone can use, it's got to be simple. So it's got to be one wearable. It's got to be a simple measure. 0 to 10, everyone gets that. Immersion is linear. 6 is twice as good as a 3. So we built a platform so everyone can measure this. You don't need a bunch of weirdo, scientists like me in your office. You don't want me in your office. Look what a weird person I am. Yeah, and motion artifact, yeah, it's controlled. So yeah, great question. So it really means it goes anywhere. I think the we don't make any money from this, honestly, but the school application is so interesting. Just having my own kids in school, man, it's tough. You got 30 people in the classroom, 30 young people. It's awfully hard to manage that without some help. It's hard enough in person, but I think virtually it's really a grind. As I said, also meetings, even for adults, team meetings are they're just different when you're virtual. So if you really want those meetings to be effective, get that information in people's brains. Oh, I didn't say that right, and I apologize. One thing that when immersion is high, most of the variation in immersion is due to this emotional component. And when you have a highly emotional experience, your brain tags that as important. Think of the birth of your child or 9/11. These highly emotional events, are saved in the brain in a very particular way that make them more easily accessed later. So those memories are stored differently. So same thing with training and education. If I can get you immersed in that education, that experience in the classroom, then you're actually going to recall that information more effectively. So that's why we see these strong correlations between immersion and information recall. So there's a bunch of neuroscience that I've glossed over greatly, but that's what we want. We want not only effective but also efficient training and education. And again, I just think we should measure.
Indeed. Next question is around, another question similar to the discussion earlier around underlying conditions that could impact the signal and the immersion factor. So this one specifically speaking to underlying conditions like diabetes or AFib. Have you looked at those, either one of those specifically?
We haven't. It's a good question. Again, because we just have clients who are starting out in that patient experience space. I think that's really got to be analyzed. I think having that patient history is going to be important. I was saying with the question earlier about chronic pain. I think the baselines may be quite different on that, and I don't think from a patient use perspective you want to kind of treat everyone the same way. So here's the trick on this. This is I think super fascinating. What we find is a very strong correlation between two individuals who are immersed in experience. So if I'm having a great experience with Ryan, his immersion in that experience will correlate strong with my immersion. So you see correlations around 0.8, I mean, actually very high. So one way to capture that patient experience without having to bother that patient to put on a wearable is to actually capture when the clinician is treating the patient, how the clinician responds. And that clinician presumably doesn't have the health deficits that the patient does. And so I can get a reflection of what that patient is doing or feeling by actually measuring that from the clinician. So we have a client in the luxury retail space that had their salespeople wear, in this case, the Scotia Rhythm Band, and they were able to predict which customers would buy with a sort of 80% accuracy. I've forgotten the exact numbers, but in this 80% range. Why? Because if the salesperson's having a ball, it's a great experience for the salesperson. It's because the customer's having a ball too. And in fact, in that study, I remember that there was a linear relationship between immersion and the amount of money spent in this sort of high-end clothing store. So again, we're really capturing that between people interaction with immersion.
Got it. Here's a really interesting one as well. Does it make sense to develop a baseline on these parameters and look at changes over time? And if so, how often would the baseline have to be reset?
Yeah, so we always baseline correct them. So we actually collect a baseline before we do the analysis so that we can compare individuals. And yeah, baseline reset's a good question. I think it depends on the activity. We generally recommend every hour that we do a new baseline. Again, if you're doing something, really energetic, again, we're really not using this in the sort of athletic training space. I think it could be, but we haven't had clients do that. Again, we're the measurement technology. We're not, we don't drive these studies. We advise clients on how to use it. Yeah, for that, I think if it's very energetic, I think I might want to get a more rapid baseline. But for normal kind of work, people at home, people in the office, about an hour seems to be fine.
Interesting. Similar question on sensor technology. Have you looked at output from other sensors such as galvanic skin response in addition to the optical heart rate monitoring?
We have, and again, the skin response adds very little predictive power and correlates strongly with changes in heart rate. So we don't need them both. They don't really add much more. So again, simplicity. So yeah, when we did this work, almost 10 years ago now with the U.S. military, we measured so many factors and people were just wired up and they looked like, Terminator robots. But we really simplified it by focusing on statistically robust signals. That is, signals that consistently predicted, and we didn't have to have redundancy in that. So again, to be a truly scalable technology, it's got to be simple. So so that's what we took 20 years. So a lot, and I left out all the painful mistakes we made and dead ends. In 20 years, I've done about 10,000 blood draws to measure changes in neurochemicals. So for me, I always start with what are the neurochemical changes for people who have a positive response, objectively observable response to that stimulus, and people who don't. So we started by looking at using public service announcements, and you watch that. We take your blood before and after and see who donated to a charity associated with that cause. Very basic science to figure out how to predict what humans would do.
Yeah, along those lines, another question came in around any work done correlating oxytocin production and immersion to sleep quality and or sleep diseases?
Great question. Oxytocin is a social chemical, so I don't think there's a big sleep response. Someone out there knows better. I'd love an email. But certainly for stress response, stress and sleep obviously are closely related. So we haven't, as far as I know, had any clients use this in sort of the sleep realm, but it would be interesting to know. Again, once it's a tool, I think, the great thing about getting it out of the lab is once you make this available, people will find lots of cool uses for it.
Yeah, absolutely. We are, just a quick time check. We're bumping up towards the top of the hour here, but quite a few more questions. Paul, do you have a few more minutes to go overtime a little bit?
Of course, for this group, anything.
Cool, appreciate that. Let's see. How does the immersion metric respond to manufactured emotional responses such as jump scares in horror movies or specific types of music?
Let's see, jump scares, we don't generally get a big emotional response. Again, I don't always see outcome data, right? So we're the software guys. And so I generally see when we transition people into using this and we sort of train them up, it takes about an hour, and then generally we hold their hand for the first time they use it. I know that one client who's a big movie studio did look at some kind of horror movies. I think the immersion was fairly low, but it's been too long. I can't remember that. And the second part of that question was
specific types of music.
Well, types of music, yeah. This is not clear for release, but one of the big music streaming services used our technology to assess music. So measured immersion in around 60 people listening to new music 6 months before its release, and they were able to predict 6 months later streams. With very high accuracy. I think it was, this was very recent, I think it was a 0.92 correlation between streams of the service and immersion. So somehow people's brains know in advance what's going to be a hit. So this is so super interesting. I only know this because we had this client in this space, but this client said that worldwide every day there are 24,000 new pieces of music released. And so from the streaming services perspective, or even radio perspective, which of those do you put on air? Which of those do you recommend people add into their music streaming services? So so what they do now is they have humans who actually listen to snippets of these new songs and go, okay, well, this one's good, this one's bad, but they're just humans. Maybe they know a lot about music, but anyway, so they're using our technology to try to optimize and also target that music. So because immersion is a continuous measure, you can threshold it and identify, we have a metric we call superfans. So people who are kind of over the moon, really high immersion for this experience, and you can actually build a demographic profile of those individuals, and then you know what music they're very likely to really enjoy. So yeah, it's a great question. Again, it's a tech, approach. I didn't know anything about the music industry, any more than anybody else. And it's just so cool to from a sort of technology perspective, as a weirdo scientist, to see people find new uses for this, for our technology.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So they can do that down to the individual song, or is it by genre, or how?
By song, yeah, exactly right. They did it across various genres, at least the data I saw. I think it was hip hop, rock, and pop, I think. Yeah, and the sample sizes are pretty small, right? So you can, instead of having 100 people in your office listening to music from around the world, you can just have those people hooked up, put on a wearable and have them listen to music, and boom, the platforms are going to start ranking those for you. So it's really efficient, and it just gets away from that. We're all kind of biased on self-report, right? We want to say the right thing, or we don't want to offend people. And asking about liking actually it's a really hard question, right? So how much do I like this piece of new music? Well, compared to what? Compared to my kids? Compared to my dog? Hey, my dog's never talked back to me. I love my dog, right? So, and if I'm hungry or tired, I'm going to report differently. So we get away from that by just measuring directly what the brain's doing.
That's fascinating. Let's see. This is timely. Do you think your immersion techniques could be useful to help children adapt to school, considering the COVID-19 concerns?
I really do. And again, I mentioned this company, Meteor Education, who's really one of the leaders in participatory learning on the K-12 space. And they've had great success on the rollout. And we're really accentuating that rollout hard in the fall, or they are. I mean, we're supporting them, obviously. But we're really excited about this. I think for parents, gosh, it's awfully hard, to keep anyone focused for more than. I talked about this 20-20-20 rule that Accenture found, and I think if teachers are going to teach hour-long classes virtually, where the kids have the camera off, at least my children at home, they turned their camera off and they were doing other stuff while the teacher's gabbing. I think immersive education, virtual education has got to be much shorter, much more intensive, much more participatory. It's not business as usual. So I'm super excited about that. Maybe only because I have school-age kids myself, but I actually still teach at Claremont myself. And so when I was teaching the second half of this, spring term, the first time I did a 3-hour class on Zoom, it was terrible. Oh gosh, it was stunk, and so I started kind of learning about, how to make that better. And then again, the amazing learning architects at Accenture had a lot of calls with those guys because they're clients, and just say, hey, what are your best practices here? Because I'm in trouble, I need help. So and having a real-time measure, so you can pivot, towards higher immersion, and also breaks. The guys at Accenture had this really nice phrase, which I like a lot. Maslow's hierarchy always wins, right? In other words, we got to take care of our basic needs first: drink, bathroom, food, or else we're not going to be able to focus on anything that's, really, learning's hard, it takes energy. And so I think building in breaks, building in downtime is actually important. And I think virtually, you don't have that for the kids. You don't have that hanging out with my kids between classes. You don't have recess, all that's kind of gone. And so I think we have to think more smartly about how to build those things back in.
Yeah, I completely agree. I've got 2 elementary school students at home who they need lots of breaks. That's for sure.
Yeah.
So next question is around, are you using this tech to understand the potential of high performance sports athletes?
No, we aren't. I think it's a great application. We've had some inquiries for soldiers, again, because a lot of our early work was funded by the military, but we haven't had any people apply it there. I think it's a really interesting application, particularly because of the motion correction. If you're working in that area, shoot me an email. It's a great conversation to have.
Next question is around, can you differentiate between high safety and low immersion from high immersion and low safety?
Oh, good question. Yes. So they're not unrelated. So neurologic frustration is a neurologic state in which you're attentive. So you have half of that immersion equation, but you're not emotionally resonant with it. You just don't care about it. So in that kind of, the data always kind of look like a sine wave because your brain is switching from immersing in that task, and then it switches to, hear the truck go by, whatever. So kind of sine wave pattern. So frustration is kind of the valleys, the low points in immersion. And we actually quantify that so that clients have a metric on how frustrated people are during the course of an experience. Where psychological safety is a little different. It's kind of over arousal, right? Attention is arousal response. So it doesn't really have an emotional component. It's really this I'm beyond the peak of that inverted U curve. So I'm just too wound up to really be able to do something well. So that was a really good neuroscience question. This is a smart audience, right? And I don't know where you got these people, but I'm impressed.
These are some great questions. Another one on confounding factors. Have you tested the technology on people with heart conditions who are on beta blockers where they have depressed heart rate variability?
Yeah, I have not. I think it's a good question. Again, I'd be quite careful to kind of have a new benchmark for those individuals. Again, we're a tool, so we certainly have tested this, lots of different ways, but not every way. So it's a great question. I think again, I would get a really good baseline on a large number of people to understand, what that population looks like.
Gotcha. And looks like just a couple more questions if you've still got the time, Paul.
Sure.
Great. Let's see. So much retail happens online now. Do online retailers express interest in measuring immersion among shoppers?
Shockingly, they haven't. And you would think, having a great customer experience is hard enough in the store. That kind of online, would be different. I think we've had a couple of people, sort of technology companies, look at kind of UX applications. But I think we haven't had any big online retailers. So so we shouldn't talk about that. But anyway, I think there are ways to do this because we have real-time interactions. So if it's one-sided where I'm searching on a big retailer's website, I think it's different. But if I have a chat, if I have a call-in, then because of this contagion of immersion, that customer service agent actually could get a reflection of what the customer is feeling. So I think that's a good application. But yeah, if you're just kind of shopping by yourself online and cruising around, it may not be that immersive as an experience.
Interesting. Looks like last question here. Have you been able to identify groups of individuals based on how fast they respond to immersion, both entering and leaving the immersive state?
I don't think we've asked that question. What we found is that you've got about 15 seconds to get people's attention. So the attentional response precedes the emotional response for immersion. And if you don't capture that attention in about 15 seconds, it's very difficult to do it. So really kind of give people a reason to pay attention to whatever you're doing. Give them a reason to care. The second is in the employee performance application, we find that when employees are highly immersed working together as teams, that they actually shed the stress of work much more rapidly. So that's really interesting to me, that kind of from a neuroscience perspective. I'm really into this project. We're all working effectively as a team. Our immersion tends to be very highly correlated. And then when that task is over, we return to baseline more rapidly, the more immersed we were. So I don't have a great science explanation for that. Could be just kind of neural fatigue, that you've kind of spent a lot of metabolic energy really focusing on this thing. Or it could be that I just feel more psychologically safe. So for the study I'm talking about, psychological safety was not measured, so I can't actually tell you if that's the case. But we like immersive experiences. We cry at movies. We enjoy love songs on the radio. And when we could get together, we like, going to happy hour with our friends. Those are really valuable experiences to us. And so if we can measure those, then we can begin to curate our lives for greater happiness. And, that's the real reason that I made this technology.
Well, Paul, this has been a really interesting discussion, fascinating work you're doing. Keep up the good work. This is really interesting stuff and really impactful work you're doing. So kudos to you for that. And I'll just say thanks so much for your time and the discussion here today. It was very much appreciated. And I think the quality of the questions indicates the level of interest and the level of compelling work you're doing.
Thank you so much, Ryan, and thanks for everyone for joining.
Yep. Thanks again, everyone, for joining, and we'll see you on the next Valence Cell webinar. Thanks, everyone.